welcome everyone to the latest in our Isolation Insights events. We're using this new Slido system that you will have noticed because you've logged in on it, but can I encourage you all please to vote in the poll? And the idea is we'll come back to what that poll ends up as after the initial comments by the panelists. If you can limit yourself to one vote each, that would probably be fairer overall. But I see a lot of you have beaten me to it. We've had 64 people voting already. So today we're tackling the rather minor and trivial question of where does politics go from here? And I'm delighted to say we have a fantastic panel, perhaps my dream panel to discuss this. We have Katy from the Spectator, who's sitting in the Spectator building, as you can see from that fine office. We have David Runciman from the University of Cambridge, and well, my top left, there's no point in me saying that because I don't know where they appear to you, Helen Thompson, also from the University of Cambridge. I think the order we've decided on is that Katy will go first, Helen goes second, David third, remarks for 5, 6, 7 minutes each. We'll have a bit of a conversation, then open up for questions. So Katy, are you happy to kick off?
Sure, I will do my best. So I think looking ahead to where we're going, I think I'm going to speak briefly about the two main parties to start. And clearly the Conservative Party is the one in government. And I think I remember when that result came through, a lot of, I think, journalists such as myself and some in the lobby thought that we were heralding an era probably more stable government. It didn't seem hard to do given what had come before, but I'd never covered a government which had, a large majority from Parliament, in that position. And I think there was a sense that this would be, it would bring its own challenges, but it would be quite different. And I think we quickly learned in the past few months that a majority of 80 isn't actually particularly big in the current climate. Several reasons for that. I think one thing that both parties are having to face is that MPs, I think, are more their own people these days. I think partly because you have things like social media, partly because I think if you look at the makeup of the Tory party, for example, I think it's hard to find values which unite every single Tory MP now. There are a couple, but I think it is different. I'm sure we'll get on to talking about the economy, but you talk about the economic message of the Tory party, I think that would be much easier to pin down 10 years ago than it is now. So I think there are different reasons why the majority of 80 doesn't feel as though we're in stable majority government. I also think that if you look ahead at the challenges this government faces, Brexit, which we always knew was going to be a big one, but also the fact that we're still living with coronavirus, also the union, I think there's lots of things that are really going to test it. So we're not looking ahead to another election for several years, but I still think it's going to be very bumpy. And I think that looking ahead to where the Tory party is going, there's lots of big questions about not just how do they get through the week, the month with things, currently as they are on Brexit, on avoiding a second wave or living with a second wave, but ultimately, what is the Tory message in 2-3 years' time? I think it's interesting that Boris Johnson often talks about his blue wall MPs. We're referring to that, the red wall. So if we go back to December, and I think it's quite clear that where Boris Johnson believes his biggest achievement was in turning former Labour heartlands Tory, many for the first time. And that's where he sees the new Tory party. But actually, I think what's really interesting is in the Tory party now, there do appear to be two sides, obviously clumsy, that there's more, but there is a big divide between, I would say, Shire Tories, traditional Tories, and this new intake of Tory MPs. And while I think that if you're looking at electoral maps and where the Tory party want to go, they see not only keeping those red wall, blue wall seats, but actually building on it as critical. I think it is bringing up lots of questions that are going to become clearer in terms of the divides in the coming year and beyond. And I think Brexit, and it's one area where I think there is the most agreement in the Tory party. That would have sounded strange a year ago, well, 2 years ago, but actually I think Brexit is where most MPs are united. So just before we went on air, we heard that when the government's legal lawyers, their top legal lawyer has stepped down. This is rather ominous because we are expecting an internal market bill to be published tomorrow, and there are big questions about whether Boris Johnson is going to renege on parts of the withdrawal agreement that he and all these MPs signed up to in that general election. So I think there are questions which I'm sure that other panellists are going to discuss in terms of what it means for wider society. But I still think on Brexit, we are at a point where, although I think we're entering a tumultuous period and we could be leaving without a deal, and lots of MPs do not currently believe that is going to happen, there is more agreement on that than lots of other challenges facing this Tory party. So I think there'll be questions about, if once we see this bill, you know, about respect to the law, what that means. But ultimately, if I would say where the Tory party is going to have to work out what it wants to say, I think the economy is going to be a huge one on this. We have been hearing about tax rises from the Chancellor. I think the problem is not just that Tory MPs all have a different opinion on what the tax rise should be. Many don't accept there should be tax rises in the first place. Now, some of them, because they have different ways they want to get growth, others just do not think that you need to have an economic policy that really connects those things. So I think that's a big question facing them. So I think Tory party, in terms of identity, I think we've got to look at the economy, also on cultural wars. I was recently talking to someone about what the Tories' message at the next election might be. And given that every time there appears to be a difficult vote, it's either been pushed back or moved, they were suggesting it might be, you know, we delivered Brexit, and we stuck up for British values. And it could be that we're heading to, because all the reforms look very tricky. So I think that in terms of the Tory party, it is still undergoing a period of change. I don't think it is cohesive from that new voting coalition yet. And I think just briefly on Labour, we have Keir Starmer, and I think it is interesting how quickly Labour's fortunes appear to have changed, not in terms of are they going to win an election, but just in terms, I think, the sense among Labour MPs, more broadly, they feel like they're suddenly in a very positive place. 2 years ago, if you spoke to a Labour MP, it felt more that you were acting as a councillor when you spoke to them. They were very traumatised, lots were thinking about leaving, some did. And I think that what Keir Starmer has managed to do in a way is bring back a feel-good factor to the Labour Party for those inside it. And there's been a big focus on values in doing that, and trying to show that, you know, going away from Jeremy Corbyn values and going to traditional British values. But I think the big test for Labour will ultimately be, what are the policies going to be? Because I think Keir Starmer's done a very good job at trying to define himself and show that he is different. I think where we still have lots of doubt, however, is where does Labour stand on things like the economy? They seem to choose a position that they think the Tories are going to be forced into. That's how our position is at the moment. But I think clearly he's going to have to start saying more about where Labour sits. So I think those are, broadly speaking, where the challenges are. And just looping it in, I think if we're thinking about the electorate more generally, who are their voters at the next election? Because if we are losing Scotland, because we haven't even spoken about Scotland, and, you know, SNP support continues to surge, Keir Starmer is going to need to win not just a red wall back, but also, you know, Lib Dem Green voters. And I think there's a question of his current values message, whether you can actually unite both sides.
Thanks ever so much, Katy. Just a couple of things maybe to ponder. You don't have to answer them now, but things that we might come back to. I mean, firstly, you said the Tories are united on Brexit. Just how united is an interesting question. And in the Playbook email, I think it was yesterday, they were talking about waiting for the reaction from moderate Conservatives to rumours about plans to rewrite parts of the withdrawal agreement. Are the Tories loyal on Brexit to a fault, or is there a line over which some of them do not want the government to tread? And the second thing on culture, I think is really interesting. I don't know if you saw the piece on Conservative Home today by Scott Benton, who's the Tory MP for Blackpool South, who basically seems to be saying, from a quick skim of it, that culture is where we win this. It's on social values that we win this. And it would be interesting maybe at some point to talk about whether, I mean, you seem to imply that that was the case from the other side, if you like, by saying that the Labour was weak on this, but I'd like to come back on that if possible. But for the moment, Helen, if you're ready.
Yeah, so I'm going to say something about the economy, and then something about Brexit and its relationship to both British domestic politics around the union and potentially sort of bigger geopolitical questions. So the first thing I would say is I think that, you know, it's inescapable that the politics of the next few years is going to be dominated by the economy. You know, there simply is no economic reset button that takes us back to the beginning of this year, if and when a COVID vaccine emerges. we are living through what is going to be a full-scale economic crisis. I think if you look, like around the world in terms of the hit in terms of growth, it's really unprecedented. It's particularly happening in so many economies at the same time. And in this country, we've had a deferred employment shock because of the furlough scheme. And that has saved us from what's happened in the United States, where you had much sharper millions of people in a very short period of time being made unemployed. So the end of the furlough scheme is in itself going to be an employment shock. And it's going to come, though, with something that I think wasn't really anticipated at the beginning of all this, which is a real, reluctance, as we've seen, both from many employees and from employers, to have people go back to working in offices in person. And this has got the potential to deliver another employment shock on top of the one that the end of the furlough scheme would already be bringing about. And I think that in some sense in this country, we've got out of the habit of really understanding what the politics of employment and unemployment looks like, because on a comparative sense, we escaped on the employment side relatively unscathed from the 2008 shock. Indeed, even if you go back to the early 1990s recession, that actually the recovery in the British economy from the unemployment in the early 90s came quite quickly. It was in sharp contrast to what happened to the 1980s. Whereas, as we know, if we go back into the 80s themselves, that then unemployment was high and it was persistent, and it completely shaped the politics of that decade. The second thing I say about the economy is that we've essentially doubled down on what happened in response to the 2008 crash. So the response of policymakers is essentially being lots more quantitative easing to facilitate lots more debt. Now, that is almost certainly necessary, but it's not benign in terms of its consequences. If we go back to what happened in the decade after 2008, QE, quantitative easing, fuels wealth inequality. We can already see even more sharp than after 2000, in the first years after 2008, dissonance between what's going on in share markets and what's going on in the real economy, and this is going to mean that the inequality aspects of the post-2008 decade are going to reappear even more strongly, I think, in the coming years. And then the central question is going to be what to do about all this debt. Now, in one sense, I think that the answer is that there's nothing, absolutely nothing that can be done about it. And so as long as investors are willing to carry on buying the bonds that governments issue, so long as central banks then buy them back, essentially it's going to continue. But there is going to be a contest, I think, about how long this situation can continue without an inflationary risk. And there is going to be a big political question about who gets to decide what this debt is used for. And I think that's probably in some sense going to be more important than the question about whether there are going to be tax rises or not to deal with it. Because in one sense, there is now so much debt that tax increases are not going to make really any difference to the risks involved. The third thing on the economic side, I think, is a question of why there is no reset is because of what's gone on geopolitically since the COVID crisis. And that is about the accelerated breakdown of the US-China relationship. Now, obviously, the big uncertainty in this is what happens in the American election, which in itself, I think, is sort of potentially a destabilizing factor given the context in which it's taken place. But if Trump were to be re-elected, then that obviously is going to intensify the decoupling of the United States from China, and it's going to mean that a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, is going to be even more confrontational with not just the EU, but Britain too, about the issues both on the trade side, EU-US trade, but also US-China trade and its technological competition and its implications for Europe than the first Trump administration, this Trump administration has been. There's also a big World Trade Organization case looming supposedly for resolution, which would allow the EU to take, if the EU were to win it, to take significant trade sanctions against the United States. So the overall trade environment in which we're dealing with this economic crisis is anything but stable. Now, on the Brexit side, I think that two really significant things have happened in the context of the politics of Brexit over the last 6 months or so. The first of them is what's happened in domestic politics in Britain. And that is both the fact that Keir Starmer has become leader of the Labour Party, and he has clearly moved the Labour Party into a position where it is not making that much criticism of the government's Brexit policy. Now, that may change over the next months, but I think it was quite a crucial moment. I think it was around June time when Keir Starmer made it clear that he wasn't really going to oppose the government's decision not to pursue an extension to the transition. I think, though, in terms of the union, that things are a lot more difficult than they were before the COVID crisis began, because what the COVID crisis has exposed is just how dysfunctional even Britain's existing, or I should say the United Kingdom's existing constitutional arrangements are for dealing, governance arrangements for dealing with a crisis. And this has not only caused clearly a lot of frustration for the government in London, but it is also strengthened, as far as the Scottish Nationalist government's concerned, is the opportunity for Scottish independence. Now, whether that will come about is another question. But I think part of the context in which we might situate the government's concerns about Northern Ireland at the moment is a realisation of just how difficult maintaining this union with all the its internal complexities on top of what was agreed in the withdrawal agreement is. And the final thing I would say is that the state aid question has really changed as a consequence of the COVID crisis, because state aid has just become much more politicised than it was before. And it's become politicised in part because of what's gone in the EU, which has effectively suspended parts of its state aid regime in order to deal with the COVID crisis. So the EU's position, I think, looks a lot more difficult than it was before the crisis in terms of what it wants from Britain, because to say that that Britain is going to stay bound to an EU state aid regime that is itself effectively suspended in order to deal with an economic emergency, in which the Commission acts as the de facto arbiter of what freedoms can be used under the suspended rules, I think will be hard for any British government to swallow going forward. And that is supercharged, if you like, by the China question, the breakdown of the China relationship, or at least on the European side, the deeper complications of the China relationship, because you have Macron in particular wanting to use the language of European industrial sovereignty and European state aid in order to deal with Chinese competition. But I think it does mean that regardless of whether there is a trade agreement at the end of this year or not, that the question of state aid in Britain and its implications for Britain's relationship with the EU is going to be a really significant, regardless of whether that agreement is signed or not. So even if we end up with an agreement, there's still going to be lots of political contest about state aid. If we don't end up with an agreement, for the time being anyway, and it becomes something that is where the government's looking to negotiate it in the future, it's going to be a really crucial part of that landscape.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, all you've convinced me of is we probably need a series of events to go through some of the issues that you've raised. I should say, actually, I should have said in my introduction that for those of you who don't know, who I imagine are very few, you should have a listen to Helen and David's podcast, Talking Politics, which is always excellent. Just a couple of things coming from what you've said, again, just as pointers for things we might talk about. You raised that question about what will the debt be used for, which seemed to dovetail with Katy's point, which is what the hell is conservative economic policy? Has there ever been a moment when we've been less certain about what the governing party wanted to do economically? That would be something that would be nice to touch on. The other thing is, given what you said about Trump, sort of begs the question as to whether this US election is a lose-lose one for the British government, because Trump might be tougher on trade, but I can't see Biden prioritising trade talks with the United Kingdom either. So who should number 10 be hoping wins this election if there are problems on both? And the whole Scotland thing we'll come back to, not least because there are several questions from the audience. Do keep answering the poll, by the way, all of you. I think we have an under 50% turnout on the poll, so I'd like to bump that up a bit if possible. So, David, while they're all doing that, over to you.
Thanks. So you've asked me to take a step back and look more broadly at what this means for democracy. I think we can be pretty confident that the pandemic the last 6 months and the next 6 months, are going to have a profound effect on democratic politics everywhere. And it's going to be an effect that will play out not in the next 2 to 3 years, but in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. It's much more like, and it picks up on what Helen said, it's much more like 2008. You're 5 years on from 2008. It'd be pretty hard to say how it had impacted politics. 10 years on, some very surprising things had happened, and we were able, with hindsight, to trace them back, but you couldn't see them coming. We're going to be really surprised. And it's similar because this crisis, like the last one, has revealed our dependence on the state, our vulnerability to the state, our vulnerability to the politicians who run the state and their incompetence. It's going to produce, as Helen said, significant winners and losers that change the dynamics of politics. And that is something that will percolate through politics. It's just not the case that you go through something as big as this and you can track it. You know, something big happens and 6 months later or 12 months later, something explicable results from it. I'm pretty sure British democracy is going to survive. Is Indian democracy going to survive this? I have no idea. Is American democracy going to survive? I was pretty confident before. I'm still pretty confident, but I wouldn't bet everything on it. We're going to be shocked 10 years on. But if I knew, I'd tell you, I have no idea what the shock's going to be. So I just want to say something about two trends in British politics I think we can think about in the longer term rather than the shorter term. And it touches on something Katy talked about and Helen as well. So one is, I feel like I've been waiting my lifetime for that stranglehold of the two-party system to break in Westminster. And every time I think it's coming, it turns out it's not. And so I've given up. And maybe at the point you give up, it happens. But anyway, 30 years is long enough to wait. So I just think, and the last election, it's true of the American election as well, it survives being tested to absurdity. Trump versus Biden, that's the choice? Seriously? But it is the choice. Corbyn's Labour versus Johnson's Conservatives, that's the choice? But it was the choice, and it was a real choice, and people made it. And actually, the choice now makes a bit more sense than it did then. Starmer brought some of the sense back into it, I think. I don't think that the stranglehold of the two parties is going to break because the electoral system's not going to change. If you change the electoral system, as in Scotland, you absolutely break it almost straight away. Scotland's not a two-party state. But even the presence of the SNP in Westminster has done almost nothing to shake it. I think the thing that is more likely to build is the bigger challenge, and that's something that really I think has been visible over the last 10 years, last decade, and that is the challenge to representative democracy itself. So not an anti-democratic challenge, not sort of authoritarianism or fascism, but there are many ways of doing democracy. Representative democracy is just one. I think we'd forgotten that a couple of decades ago. It's just one way of doing it. And I think it's really struggling. This system with elections as its focus, professional political parties, a professional political class, a pretty narrow professional political class. The kinds of people who go into politics are not representative of the wider public still. Their competence has been tested and I think exposed in various ways. And it's built, and you've seen it building over recent years. So I think the referendum was a manifestation of this, the Brexit referendum, both the fact of it and the result of it. It wasn't some internal Tory party management issue for David Cameron. It was genuinely driven in part by a sense, both among the professional political class and among large swathes of the British electorate, that certain questions were not being discussed in a representative democratic system, particularly a two-party system, but maybe in any system, because it's not being discussed in many European systems either. Voices were not being heard. Different means had to be found to allow people to express themselves democratically. I think you see it really acutely around climate. So we haven't touched on it, I don't think, but climate change is the central political issue of the 21st century. And I really am not optimistic that representative democracy is well set up to tackle climate change. Representative democracy is reactive, that's its strength. When something goes wrong, eventually, usually, manages to sort it out. It's not proactive. It never has been. And climate change is a proactive problem. And whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's increasing demands for forms of citizen assembly, deliberative democracy, these things are happening on the fringes of our politics, but they're coming closer. The sign that people are so agitated now about Extinction Rebellion, it's coming closer. And these are expressions it's not anti-democratic Extinction Rebellion. These are expressions of frustration with a representative democratic system, professional political class, that not only is non-representative in lots of really important ways, but may well be inadequate in really important ways. I think representative democracy has one massive inbuilt advantage, which is why it's survived the places where it has survived so long, which is that most people don't want to do politics with their lives because it's boring. And they've got better things to do, love, work, play. Money matter more to most people than politics. And representative democracy's great advantage is that even if you hate them, you can let the politicians get on with it. But politics it's impinging on our lives, and the virus has shown it in ways that's really hard to escape. I mean, being locked down makes it really hard to think, well, politics is kind of something I'll leave to other people. That's going to accelerate it. And then we all know that I think the digital revolution, but particularly the social media revolution of the last 10 years, is going to accelerate it. And it's turbocharging it as we speak. Twitter, Instagram, these things are an affront to representative democracy. I mean, they really, in many ways, scandalize it. And they're also democratic. These are democratic platforms. They're not run democratically. They're run by autocratic tyrants, people like Mark Zuckerberg, but they are democratic in the sense that they allow a voice that cannot be heard for many people in other ways. So I would say finally that if I had to say what's going to happen in the longer term, 5-10 years, we've got in Britain a political system that seems locked in, two-party, maybe the next party will get a turn next time, but it still looks hard to see how it breaks open. And then we've got growing frustration with representative democracy, with other kinds of democratic outlets wanting to be seen and heard. And that contest, very unpredictable, but I think over 5-10 years, something's going to give there. And that may be where the surprise is. So it's not so much a surprising election result but something actually does give in the end, that this way of doing politics cannot accommodate people's desire for change.
I am at some point, I hope, going to push you a bit on that. Something is going to change, in the sense that if what you're hinting at is that representative democracy itself as a system might be the thing that gets challenged, rather than focusing on the ballot box and results of elections, what could take, and I know you said we're going to be surprised, I'm not asking you to predict, I'm just asking you to sort of sketch out maybe alternatives. Before I do that, let me just turn to this poll and just see if any of you are in the least bit surprised. I was a little bit surprised. So we said, what's going to be the biggest political headache over the next 12 months for the government? And the options were an SNP majority in May next year, the economic and political fallout from Brexit, the unemployment caused by the end of furlough, a more united Labour Party, or a second wave of COVID. And the results were a united Labour Party got 2% of the vote, second wave got 17, unemployment got 20, I should have had SNP majority got 9, unemployment shock got 21, but the clear winner, interestingly enough, was navigating the economic and political fallout from Brexit at 51%. That slightly surprises me, actually. I don't know if any of you want to react to that. Would you agree with that that is the biggest political challenge the government is going to face?
If I can say very briefly, it's the most predictable one. So the reason it's hard to talk about the second wave is that there is a scenario in which that would overwhelm any other challenge. But of course, there's another scenario in which actually the worst is behind us, and we genuinely don't know. I think my guess is the reason that one comes top is that is going to be a challenge come what may.
Helen?
Yeah, I am. I'm not saying I'm surprised, because that's making a comment on people's opinions. But I mean, I don't think that there's any reason any longer to think that in political terms for the government, that the problems of Brexit are going to compare with the problems of the economic situation. And in good part, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that which actually fits also with Katy's point about relative unity within the Conservative Party, that the politics of the situation, because of the result of the last general election and because of the Labour Party's shift and the fact that Keir Starmer hasn't been contesting really what Boris Johnson has been doing over Brexit, are significantly easier than they were, with one big caveat, but that big caveat is a Scottish question that actually features as a separate question on the poll. And even there, I would say that it's actually what's happened over COVID and what has exposed about the difficulties of the constitutional arrangements, not just the constitutional arrangements actually, but the administrative decision-making apparatus of the UK state that have actually made the Scottish question more difficult than it was at the beginning at the beginning of this year. And in some sense, I think that Brexit can feature so highly because it is, as David suggested, it's a known unknown, and that the fact of the matter is about the economic situation is that we don't quite understand yet what the scale of the difficulty is, because we haven't actually hit what I still think is a double employment shock to come, and because we've been acclimatized out of understanding how bad unemployment can be, because the British economy, whatever else can be said about it over the last few decades, has done well on keeping people in jobs. Those jobs may have been insecure often, and they may not have been particularly well paid, but we haven't had the politics of mass unemployment since the 1980s, and I think we're in danger of forgetting what it looks like.
Katy, I can put a more specific question to you based on the poll finding. Do you think Keir Starmer has handled Brexit well to date, and do you think he's going to have to adapt his handling of it in the weeks and months to come?
To be honest, I think if we're talking since Keir Starmer became Labour leader, I think it's really hard to assess how he's handled Brexit, because to me, I have to scratch my head slightly to think what he has done on Brexit. If we're talking about what he did when he was serving in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, we know that he was vital in moving the party to a position more supportive of a second referendum. People behind the scenes say he played a very active role. It delights Number 10 that they can call him a Remainer lawyer. I think there's some doubt as to how effective that is as an attack line. I think there's quite the level of anti-lawyer sense in the country that perhaps some believe. But I think since becoming Labour leader, it goes back to ultimately who is Keir Starmer trying to win over, keep on side, look to. And I don't think Keir Starmer completely knows the answer to that yet. And I think that goes some way to explaining why Labour are pulling their punches slightly here. But I also think, it is just a tricky territory for them. And I think it's interesting, the poll finding, because it feels, apart from this week Brexit is back at the front of the news agenda. Since Boris Johnson won his majority of 80, he's wanted to have this Brexit government, but he hasn't really got his way. We've been talking about, a public health crisis for most of the time he's been in power. So it feels like Brexit has been away from the news agenda. I think it is getting back to that, and that probably means Keir Starmer, and he is coming under more pressure to have a position. But I think it's something for several reasons he doesn't want to do, because, and again, we're going back to Scotland and all these conversations slightly on the edge, but huge questions on Scotland in terms of independence, but also just in terms of if it is a country that is ultimately majority SNP for a long time. Where does Labour win seats? And I think the really tricky thing for Keir Starmer is if you say Scottish Labour is not coming back in a significant capacity, the seats that Keir Starmer would need to win, in terms of the different attitudes towards Brexit, very difficult to see how you do that by talking about Brexit. In a way, I think you do it by not talking about Brexit.
Okay, I'll come back to, but just while we're on Scotland, because I feel we should mention, there's a really interesting question from David Martin saying, is there anything that the UK government can do to save the Union, or is the future of the UK going to be settled in Scotland? Is it effectively out of the hands of the UK government now, or are there things that the government can do to strengthen the Union? I suppose the obvious thing the government can do is refuse a referendum, but
or win it.
Yeah.
And fight it better than they fought the Brexit referendum and learn the lessons. And the good thing about referendums, if you're fighting them, is there's quite a lot of case studies now to draw on and try and work out how to not screw it up next time.
Unless you draw exactly the wrong lessons, as arguably
Which
might have been the case.
occasionally happens.
Yeah. But Helen, do you think, is there, if you were advising the British government on its union strategy, what would you say they should be doing to try and alter sentiment in Scotland?
Well, I think it's actually very hard for the present government to do that. I mean, its best strategy in some sense, although it's certainly obviously a risky one, is as David said, to allow a referendum to happen and then to win it. I think that it's hard to get round a paradox, though, or it's not quite a paradox, is that the best thing the Conservatives could do for the union would not be to be not in power for a while, would be to lose the next general election, because so long as the union, the electoral politics of the union keep producing Conservative governments at Westminster, that is destabilising for the union. On the other hand, as we know, as Katy's been saying, the Labour's position in Scotland, the very fact there is an issue about Scottish secession from the union, makes it really quite difficult for there to be any party in power in Westminster other than the Conservatives. So I think that in some sense this is a reason why there isn't really any alternative in the medium term anyway to holding a referendum and the British government, whichever party indeed it is in power, taking its chances over winning it. And I think that if we bring Brexit back into it, is that it is also the case, as we know, and I think has been demonstrated reasonably clearly since the referendum result on Brexit, that Britain's departure from the European Union does make the practical material case for Scottish independence more difficult.
Can I just say one thing, because it touched on, Helen said we've forgotten what the politics of employment and unemployment looks like. Even more recently, the politics of currency questions was a big part of British politics. We understood it in relation to the euro, and then it was a huge issue in the 2014 referendum. And we'd kind of moved away from that. I think we've forgotten because other things have taken its place. You have a Scottish independence referendum. The question of the currency is central again. And that does give the British government some leverage, which can be used either in a positive way or for a very negative fear-based campaign, which they did last time. But currency questions, I mean, Helen will, I think, agree with me on this. Currency questions do not go away just because we don't talk about them.
Mm. My first instinct on listening to Helen is that she wouldn't be a government advisor for very long if her first piece of advice to the Prime Minister was lose the next election if you want to keep Scotland. But anyway, I mean, there's a question from Nuala O'Neill, which is so broad, I wasn't sure that I would ask it, but it opens up lots of lines of inquiry that you've touched on. And the question is, has populism changed the political landscape forever? Which is massive, but it kind of nudges us towards some of the things that David was saying, which is that alternative forms of engagement are on the rise. And it might be that over the medium term, they have an impact on the workings of our system. Are you happy to try and flesh out what you were hinting at, David, when you were talking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, briefly, so the word populism is important and we use it, but in a way, I think for this question, we shouldn't get too stuck with it because populism is more symptom than cause of the thing I was talking about, which was a desire, frustration with and a desire to get beyond or get round some of the limitations of representative democracy. Populism then, because we're still stuck with representative democracy, gets channeled through representative institutions and often comes unstuck, as it has done in various places, maybe even in this country. But nothing changes the political landscape forever. A changing political landscape keeps changing. And I think one of the interesting things that goes back to what we were just talking about. So one of the obvious outlets for frustration with representative democracy is referendums. And if you look around the world, they've been on the increase almost everywhere in stable, established representative democratic systems. Politicians have been reaching for them much more often, partly in response to demand and partly because it is a management tool, broad management tool. And in this country, politicians, many of them are profoundly scarred by the last two referendums and would really like not to keep fighting them. I think, given a choice, there's a slight sort of phobia around referendums. So if you shut off, that is one outlet. It's a crude one, but it's a legitimate one. This thing is going to come out in other places. It's not just going to funnel back into parliamentary politics. It's not going to funnel back into the two main parties. It's not just going to settle down. I think it was an illusion that 2019, big majority, it felt like an election from the 80s or the 70s even, big majority two-party politics was settling British politics down for the reasons Katy said. You think the election result happens and, okay, we're going to get back to something. And it's chaos. It's chaos. And it's partly because there is a build-up of pressure to find other ways. Now, deliberative democracy citizens' assemblies have got a long way to go to get any purchase, but some aspect of that is coming. Street politics, another thing that we sort of forgot about. We look at Extinction Rebellion and we think it's somehow some new fringe thing. Street politics is democratic politics, as long as it doesn't involve outright violence. Civil disobedience and forms of non-violent protest are real democratic politics. If you do shut off the referendum, I think you increase the likelihood not that representative democracy reorients itself so that it works really well. Because it doesn't, it just doesn't. It's got many virtues, but it's got many weaknesses. These other things will be on the rise. And there will also be skillful representative democratic politicians who learn, as say Farage did, who learn how to use them in pursuit of power. There will be a democratic politician before too long who works out how to use a citizen assembly to become a prominent, powerful figure in the land. That will happen, just hasn't happened yet.
Interesting. Do either of you have anything to add? I've written down about 40 questions. I'm not kidding. We're not going to get through them all. But do either of you have anything to add on that sort of macro question? Don't worry if not, because I want to turn to it. I mean, there's a conflict there. There's another conflict going on at the moment, of course, which seems to be a conflict between government and civil service, which might be seen as a broader sort of conflict within the framework of the British Constitution, because we all know, I mean, both big parties were talking about some sort of constitutional review in their manifestos for last year's election. And I suppose a two-part question, the first of which would be, is it good politics to be at war with the civil service? Is it sustainable? Does it impinge on issues of competence that David was talking about earlier? I mean, does this make sense, and how long can it go on for, I suppose, is the first thing. Because I don't know if you saw today that another civil service resigned over the issue of whether the government was planning to renege on its legal obligations under the withdrawal treaty. And I think that story is sort of getting filled out as we go. But is this just posturing by the government? Is there something more significant? Is it good politics? Is it a good way to approach policy making? Can you sort of unpick what's going on with the civil service? I can hear Jill Rutter in my head saying that's the wrong question, but anyway.
I mean, I think on civil service, I think there are I think it's hard to define how Number 10 and this government treat the civil service as one cohesive attitude. I think that there is definitely a general theme, one that's not particularly positive towards the civil service, and we've seen that with lots of the permanent secretaries going. I still think there are a few cases where, for example, it can be tempting to weave everything in Number 10 anti-civil service, it plays to the base. It's also the case that civil service votes should remain, and that's Number 10's view. That's the theory you hear. I think that if you look, for example, back to when you had Priti Patel effectively at war with her permanent secretary, not just stepping down, but giving a public statement, like quite extraordinary. I think that was more to do with a personal relationship and specific issues, if that makes sense, rather than this general sweeping. So I think you've got to break it down a bit, but I think it's quite clear that there is a strong sense, both from Boris Johnson's key advisors, and I think you can find various videos on YouTube where Dominic Cummings has said these things at think tanks. It's not too hard to assign views to people. But there's a strong sense that ultimately Whitehall as it currently sits doesn't work. And I think some of that isn't meant personally. Sometimes there are personal grudges. I think this is a Number 10 that holds a grudge. But I think that the wider problems in, I think, this government's view with the civil service is just the way it runs, the idea that you move between departments. The idea, and again, I believe civil servants will clearly find things I'm saying here which are unfair and wrong in how I'm describing it, but the sense in government is you move between briefs, you don't have specific enough knowledge, there's not a level of self-responsibility or things coming back for your actions. And I think that's what's driving the whole kind of scale of reform. If it's good politics, it's definitely the case that there are people they specifically don't like. We've seen lots of permanent secretaries go. I think that if we're looking as to what this leads to, I think the problem for this government is that there's only so long you can blame you can find ways to keep doing it, but I think there's only so long you can blame other people, key senior figures in departments, institutions for decisions before it comes back to you. And I think the issue that Number 10 have is the choice to move around lots of permanent secretaries, to oust or agree that some will go, means that I think that the next time around, if there is a problem and you say, well, it was that person and they were the replacement for the troublesome person, just as a general rule in life, it holds less merit. So I think that it really depends on whether their decision-making in the first place is valid or not, because either they are going to be vindicated in a few years' time and things are running much more smoothly, or you're going to have the same problems. And I think it is the case that more responsibility will have to be taken by the government.
I suspect if I were a senior civil servant, I would be thinking, lecturing us about a lack of responsibility and accountability is a bit rich coming from you lot at the moment, because, and it's interesting in the context of my...
And I think, to be honest, and at the same time, of course, you can look at lots of things the government have done, or even recent news articles about not understanding things that they've apparently signed. And I think there's plenty to aim at the government there, but I think just in understanding why the government are on this mission, it goes down to those factors. That's what they believe.
And can I just say something briefly? It connects back to the previous thing. I mean, the other way that on the broader issue of where democracy is heading that this goes is, as representative democracy struggles, you get other kinds of democratic impulses, but you also get a desire to take things out of democratic politics. So we haven't talked about the courts. Mm-hmm. The other question with Scotland, you can be absolutely sure if we get to a Scottish independence referendum, the Supreme Court is going to play a role in British politics again. And we saw a bit of what that looks like last time, and it's pretty fractious. It's quite knife edge stuff on these big questions. I think the relationship with the civil service is similar, particularly around the role of, we've seen it in the pandemic, around the role of science and so on. It's not just you've got representative democracy in a kind of groundswell of popular or populist or street level politics. You've got representative democracy and increasingly some questions, either because of their complexity, their technical demands, or simply because Parliament is not well set up to deal with them, get removed to forms of either professional or expert bodies that are not democratic. Mm-hmm. And that trend is also going to get more pronounced over the next 5 to 10 years.
Helen, did you want to come in at all?
Yeah. I think that the government had got itself into a very difficult position with the civil service because of the conjunction really of Brexit and its analysis of the civil service's position in relation to Brexit, and then what happened with the COVID emergency. So if you go back to like the referendum campaign back in 2016 and the people in the Leave campaign, Johnson and Gove and Cummings obviously in particular, that the idea that the civil service as it functioned, as they saw it, was not adequate for dealing with Brexit was there right from the start. Mm-hmm. You can see it in the ideas that they had when they thought that Boris Johnson was going to become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister after Cameron quit, before the two of them Johnson and Gove, I mean by that, self-destructed over the Conservative Party leadership. And then they had the view that the civil service played its part in the nature of the first withdrawal agreement that was negotiated in a way which they saw, particularly Johnson saw, as Brexit in name only. So right from the start, in some sense, structurally embedded into this government is the idea that the civil service had to be reformed. But the time when they had the opportunity, if they thought they could do that after the 2019 general election, when they had the majority, very quickly then ran into a few months later, ran into the pandemic emergency, at which point this very government that wanted to engage in radical civil service reform had to work with the civil service and the existing policy machinery in order to deal with an unprecedented health emergency, and do so at the same time as finding out that all the bits of the union didn't work when the British government in Westminster had to act as the English government over health and education matters in the end. So I think it was entirely predictable that this turned out to be, a pretty chaotic mess, and that now there's a lots of recriminations flying around. And I don't think that the issue is going to go away.
I mean, have any of you changed your minds on the need for a written constitution? I mean, given the chaos, the mess, the sort of uncertainty, the number of unwritten rules that we've become aware of that seem to structure our system in a very ambiguous way.
One question with that, to get it not just written, because it sort of is written, it needs to be codified.
Yeah, codified.
Is would we do the democratic version of that, of the codification? Almost certainly there would be, then that would be a point which there'd be huge pressure to have a different kind of representative citizens body that was involved. Or would we do the take it out of democratic politics and get a bunch of experts together to sort this mess out? That question would then become so acute that I think it would be really hard to do it because there would be very, very rival views about how to do it. Now, the trouble with our politics is the how-to questions are almost harder to solve than the what-to-do questions. We often have a fairly clear idea of what we should do about some things, but because we're stuck with a system which is locked into some rigid structures that are really hard to reform, democratic systems that are well established are terrible at reforming themselves. I mean, you even touched on Helen's point, even trying to reform the civil service, because you're always firefighting, and then the winners always have some incentives to hold on to a lot of what already happened because it got them into power. It's incredibly hard, incredibly hard. I know it's not answering your question. I haven't said, I think we should have one as well.
But presumably harder because we're polarised. I mean, that's why I was slightly sceptical about what you said about citizens' assemblies, is they seem to work in countries that aren't as deeply polarised as this. But my sense about citizens' assemblies is there'll be so much fighting about who's on it, what the specific question is, about the process, because we're so divided.
Yeah, there could be, just in the way that I said there would be for a constitutional convention. On the other hand, under these kinds of conditions where there is genuine frustration, and there is a lot of evidence that some of those polarizations can be overcome, I think it could go lots of different ways, but I don't think we should assume under current conditions that alternatives to parliamentary representative democracy that are clearly and obviously democratic will just run into the same problems that parliamentary democracy runs into, which is that no one can agree on anything. We never experiment with our politics. We never experiment with democracy because we think if we fiddle around with it, we'll fall back into fascism or something, but we won't. So we should try.
But we have experimented in one way over the last couple of decades, haven't we? Which is, and this brings us to the question from Keith Raffan, the former MP and MSP, which is referenda. We've used referendums. They've become part of our system now. But his question, and I suppose it feeds more broadly into the questions about the challenges to representative democracy, is there a fundamental tension between referendums and representative democracy? And so are referendums, even though we're stuck with them now, it seems to me, a significant part of the problem we face because of the impact they have and because they can pull in an opposite direction to representative politics. That's for anyone, not just for you,
Helen. Helen, you do it.
Well, I think one of the things is we've got to recognise is that the move to referendums has been particularly strong in Europe, and it's been particularly strong for a reason, and that is that the nature of the European Union generates, like referendums. It started doing it, in the 1970s, when the group of states that are acceded to the European Union in 1973, not Britain, must be noted, in 1973, Britain didn't have its referendum until 2 years later, started holding referendums on membership. This is not something that any of the 6 states that originally formed the European Economic Community did. And then some of those states went on to start having referendums on treaties that the EU generated. The original 6 states in the early years. So, in one sense, you can say that if Britain leaves the European Union, or Britain is leaving the European Union, has left the European Union, then that particular pressure for referendums goes with it. I think the difficulty, though, again, goes back to the Union, because we've already had the precedent of the Scottish referendum in 2014. We've got a strong demand with the Scottish government for another one. There's obviously the possibility of things of a border poll in relation to Northern Ireland at some point as well. And because of the fact that the constitutional changes that were made by the Blair government in particular left the governance arrangements for England in a void, we've actually ended up having to have really emerged through this crisis, I would say, an English government. In that sense, I would say that this is where I disagree with David a bit, is that our politics here has not proved itself rigid. It's actually proved itself that it's simply adapted to something, the nature of this emergency, that required an English government. But this English government now has no constitutional authority to ground it in. So I think that at some point, I stress at some point, because of how to deal with the different aspects of it is really quite hard, there will probably be referendums in order to try and sort out how you legitimate democratic authority in this union of the United Kingdom.
That's what we talked about this earlier, muting yourself and forgetting. Katy, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Helen's right. We are seeing the effects now of referendums and then Parliament trying to catch up or adapt. But there are lots of issues there. I mean, I think we're going to see more referendums. The Scottish independence question is the most obvious. But I think in terms of how we adapt, I think it goes a bit wider. For example, I think one of the things coronavirus has done is I think so many more people are now aware of the, devolved settlement, how devolved issues work, who weren't previously. And I think that has made issues relating to referendums and referenda more apparent too. So I do feel that looking over the past couple of months, it means that they're, in a way, I would use loose ends, but I just remembered that is what a cabinet minister used yesterday to describe legal issues potentially relating to Brexit. But, I think that there is this sense that everything as it currently is might function, but I think it's exacerbating issues, which will mean that there is a higher force or push for referendums to look at those issues.
I mean, that issue of what people have learnt about us as a country over the course of the last few years is really. I mean, we organised a citizens' assembly up in Manchester in 2017, as I recall, and in the first tea break, this elderly lady, she must have been in her 60s or 70s, came up to me and said, just said, "I'm really worried about Henry VIII powers." And I thought, wow, I mean, Brexit is having a real educational impact on the British population, that we're now going to start talking about delegated legislation and its impacts on democracy. Then we've had a few questions on foreign policy, and I want to turn to that right at the end, because it seems to me we need to touch on some of the massive issues that Helen raised. But there's one thing I want to come back to, I mean, partly because it's something I'm a little bit obsessed with, which is the point Katy initially raised, which is, what are the economic policies of this government? Which way will this government head? Is this genuinely going to be a completely new sort of Conservative government? Are the numbers in Boris Johnson's favour if he wants to be a sort of tax and spending Tory Prime Minister? Or is that something that's going to get gridlocked because of divisions in his own coalition? They're all massively unanswerable questions. I know, Katy, but I want to start with you and just get your opinion, and maybe turn to Helen after that and see where she thinks the direction of travel. I mean, obviously there are a lot of unknowns, not least what the economy is going to look like. But
I mean, I'm not sure that Boris Johnson does want to be tax and spend. I think he wants to be spend, ultimately. And I think the Treasury is looking at tax measures and others. And I think it was a really good point made earlier on about the fact that clearly, if you look at the level of borrowing that we've just gone, playing around with a few tax bands is not something that's going to fix that. But the big question is, day-to-day spending going forward. I think you have a situation where the Treasury, and I don't just mean that as, what Tory MPs would describe as the institutional Treasury, I think the Chancellor too, do take the view that you need to have fiscal competence going forward. And we heard that when Rishi Sunak spoke to MPs last week. Boris Johnson was by his side, but I do think that I think you have to be careful how you talk about these things, because quickly they become stories, Chancellor versus Prime Minister. But I do think in terms of economic policy that I don't think number 10 are necessarily in the same place as number 11. And we know from Boris Johnson's previous time as Mayor of London, you look at the crash then, that he likes to have a policy of growth. But how possible is that when we're currently in a situation where it's really hard to go back to even the measures that you would usually want to have a normal functioning economy. So I think that if you're looking at what this government's economic policy is, I think it's a really interesting question because it's just incredibly hard to pin down. But I think in terms of MPs and where they are, like everyone nowadays, in a way that you would not have expected 10, 15 years ago, Tory MPs are most likely, if you bring up this issue, to talk about, historically low borrowing rates, and actually this is fine, we can just keep borrowing. And I think the issue clearly is, and I think something the Treasury has looked at, is if you stress test what happens if interest rates change even slightly, the current situation the UK is in gets much more difficult. So I think there is eventually going to be a reckoning. But I think where Tory MPs are, for various reasons, I think they're so far away from anything that resembles austerity, big mess cuts. And that's for two reasons. First, you have the new intake, and lots of them actually are, they feel like they are very strong Conservatives, partly because lots of them are local MPs from red wall areas, and they grew up somewhere where it wasn't very cool to be a Tory. It might not be cool to be a Tory anywhere, but particularly in these areas, you don't have it was not a majority view. But at the same time, I think they've all just campaigned on a manifesto where they said they were going to spend lots of money and they're going to be the high spend party. So they don't want to go anywhere near Cameron and Osborne austerity. And then the other part of the Tory MPs, I think, which are like a loud group, are ultimately those who are stung from successive elections, going out on the doorstep and getting the backlash. And they no longer think it is politically toxic. So I don't think there's coherence on who carries the burden, on what the long-term plan is. But I think that even if Rishi Sunak did want to bring in a strict, not the tax horror show he said isn't coming, but even were he to change his mind and do that, I don't think this Tory party would wear it, and I doubt Number 10 would either.
There's a really interesting conversation to be had about just how local some MPs are, how they really see themselves as local representatives in a way that perhaps wasn't the case always. Before I come to you, Helen, I have to apologise sincerely to Nicola Murray for implying that 60 and 70-year-olds were elderly. Sorry about that. I would have replied in writing, but I can't figure out how to do it on Slido. But Helen, on the economic question.
Yeah, I think that, you can't really ask what the government's philosophy is going to be about managing the economy, because it's simply going to be crisis managing the economy. It's not going to have the luxury, of having a particularly ideological view of what's going on. But in part for that reason, I think that Boris Johnson is going to have an easy chance on this, or someone in his position is going to have an easier chance winning the argument against Rishi Sunak than Sunak's going to have winning the argument about taxes, for some of the reasons that Katy says, but also because the one thing that will concentrate the mind and give we must do something about the debt advocates a chance will be if bond markets start making it harder for governments to borrow. But at the moment, there's no possibility of that. I think in the end that will happen, but I don't think there's anybody who's got any idea when that is likely to be. And for a long time, you could say is that George Osborne was still worrying, I would say, about the bond markets until sometime in 13-14. I think he'd given up on it by 2015. But the fact is that in the end, after the first few years after the crash, is they did not act in any kind of disciplining way on what governments did, either in Europe, once the Eurozone crisis was done, or at least once Draghi had made his whatever it takes speech, or in the United States. And you're simply not going to get to a politics of deficit reduction, let alone debt reduction, without that financial market constraint coming back. And given that what we have learned since 2008 suggests that it can be absent for really quite a long period of time, is why would any politician who's got to worry about winning the next election start thinking, okay, I better start from the premise that it will come back before the next general election, because there's a real possibility that it won't.
And can I just quickly say something, because it touches on what you said at the beginning, because we haven't talked about this. So say Biden wins, we're used to thinking that it's Trump's America, and whatever that tells us about the state of the world is to do with these big questions about populism and immigration and race and so on. But if Biden wins, which is a pretty good chance he might, then America becomes a place that people look for very different kinds of lessons, because he's winning on it has become now a big spending program. There's a big commitment there to form a big government. Some of the questions that Helen's asked about what's the point at which the market starts to get really nervous. I mean, Biden is really, he's also, he believes in spend, but there's some tax in that too. But there's big spending coming in the United States, probably. And I think British governments of whatever stripe are going to go back to that thing of not looking to America as some kind of morality tale or warning of, you know, how the world can go wrong, but what it used to be maybe in the 80s and 90s, the biggest, most powerful, richest democracy in the world, doing stuff that we may end up doing too, and seeing how that works. I mean, a Biden presidency does make a big difference just in terms of where people look for lessons. Trump, you don't look for lessons really, you just hope that you survive it. But Biden, you look for lessons.
Interesting. I mean, and on the United, we've got a question from Robert Smith. I don't think there's an answer to this, which is why I'm going to put it to you, which is, what is driving British foreign policy at present? And there have been a couple of other comments about, you know, how does Britain's world role evolve over the next decade? And can I start with you, Helen? I mean, you can riff around this if you want. You don't have to. I mean, I'm not sure there's a clear answer to the question, but you talked a lot about, you know, the geopolitics of this. How does the UK position itself now? Will we ultimately be forced by geography and common interest to actually collaborate a lot more with the EU on geopolitics than this government seems to want to do, or is there another way?
Well, I think you've got to draw a distinction between the issues, the big issues in geopolitics at the moment. And I'd say if you take sort of three that have featured quite strongly at different points since the pandemic, but obviously were there before as well, which would be China and the Hong Kong issue, Iran and what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. I say on the Eastern Mediterranean, that Britain doesn't seem to be particularly involved, and the government doesn't seem to have taken a position, in very sharp contrast to what Macron's been doing, who's got something to say about what's going on in the East Mediterranean most days, and, you know, deploys French naval power sometimes to match what he's saying. If you take the other two issues, though, I think what's interesting is that during the pandemic, that essentially on Iran, that the government has stayed relatively closely hugged to the EU position, including, you know, not being willing to support Trump over the UN arms embargo, which is coming to an end next month. But on the China and the Hong Kong issue is that the British government, particularly because of the Hong Kong question, has moved much closer to the American position than the EU position. And you can see that as well over the Huawei issue, the fact that this is clearly not going to happen in the UK, whereas Merkel seems still to be defending its presence in German 5G network development. So it looks to me is that the British government's position is not to have it always. I don't think that it's quite that, but not to be in a consistent position anyway of saying, okay, we're all in with the US now on these big geopolitical questions, and we're not on the EU side. Now, I think what's interesting on the US election front is that the one area where probably who wins isn't going to make a great deal of difference is on the China question. It's not that there's not going to be changes in different emphasis between Trump and Biden over that, but the US is clearly not going back to the pre-Trump position where China is concerned. That China is going to be treated as a strategic competitor, a strategic rival. And the question then, I think, really will be for the EU is like, well, would Biden, whilst he was pushing for the US to be as confrontational on trade and technology as Trump has been, and potentially on Hong Kong as well, would he be more tolerant of the European states, the EU in particular, having more independence from the US in dealing with the China question? Or is he going to really stick to Trump's position there, which is you guys are going to shift with us, and we're going to use our financial power in order to try and ensure that you do. And I think that the way that question turns out, if it were a Biden presidency, will have some consequences for Britain's positioning.
Well, I suppose the third option is whether Joe Biden, because he's not Donald Trump, has greater power of persuasion when it comes to the Europeans and manages to take them with him more consensually in terms of adopting a tougher position towards China.
I think that's pretty hard for the German position. I mean, the German position is so commercially entrenched in China, and both on the telecommunications issue and obviously on the car manufacturers. I don't think that they can be persuaded out of it by anybody.
It's also, it's interesting, we're comfortable talking about British foreign policy as though it were a single thing. In everything else, we've been aware that Scotland is increasingly becoming a separate country. And it could easily, on some of these issues too, I mean, that's an issue that would certainly come up in a Scottish referendum. These foreign policy questions are big political questions with domestic consequences, how you relate to the next American president or whoever it is. And British foreign policy, it's more coherent than British economic policy, but it's not completely coherent. Scotland is another country.
In fact, I mean, to be honest, I'm not completely convinced we've actually had a foreign policy that's been in any way thought through since the 2013 vote on Syria. I think since then it's been purely reactive, and actually be interesting to see what comes out of this integrated review, because you'd think that you'd have to have a vision of your role in the world before you carried that kind of...
I would just say briefly on that. I mean, I think that when you're looking at the various things this government wants to do from Brexit, and we didn't even get onto state aid earlier, and we were talking about the economy, which is obviously interesting in itself because lots of people thought the Tory argument for Brexit was going to be, Singapore on the Thames, and now we're hearing about, how this is all going to be held up on state aid. But I think where I think it's easier to work out the government's intentions, actually, I think there is, from the Vote Leave group, from people like Dominic Raab, I think there is what they see as quite clear foreign policy. I think that some coming up would describe it as an ethical foreign policy. Lots of people would point to previous things the UK has done with Saudi Arabia. But ultimately, I think if you look at Hong Kong and the offer of citizenship, I think foreign policy is where Boris Johnson believes that he can show that he is a liberal conservative still. People want to say he's a populist. I think that, if you look at Vote Leave on EU nationals, things like that, wanting to guarantee the rights. Then we had Theresa May, took a different stance. I think that although it's not comprehensive and it can't be the only thing, I think that the foreign policy is viewed as somewhere where you can actually push a lot of those instincts and those ideas, and that's something they're going to try and do.
Brilliant. On that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So let me just end this by saying, firstly, thank you to the audience for joining, and apologies for difficulties in joining this time. This is a bit of a trial run with Slido, and we've had some teething problems that I've been made aware of in the Q&A column, not least, but we'll learn from those mistakes and hopefully get better at that. Secondly, there's an online event survey that we'd like you to fill in. If you can face it, that would be great, not least so we can learn from your experiences. And finally, last but not least, my heartfelt thanks to the three of you. I mean, to say that was wide-ranging would be an understatement. At a minimum, it's given people plenty of food for the thought, and I hope that one day we can invite you all back and we can maybe look back on this conversation and look forward again and reflect more on British politics, which, let's face it, is a really interesting thing to be writing and researching on at the moment. So thank you all very, very much indeed, and I'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.